Welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. Sabina Hulbert, and I'm one of the researchers at NICER, the National Institute for Christian Education Research, who worked on the Nexus project. Today, I'm not going to talk about the Nexus project in detail because you will have heard about the main research aims somewhere else in some other of the presentations, or if you haven't done that, you can probably go back on the main page and find a similar recording that explains what the overall project is actually about. As the title says here, I'm going to talk about the statistical nitty-gritty, really, the more detailed analysis of some of the sections of the quantitative data that we have. And again, I haven't mentioned my collaborators of the project. There are, of course, Dr. N. Casson, that, as I said, conducted all the qualitative part of the study. Mary Hooley, who did one of the in-depth analyses for a section of the qualitative again data, and then Professor Bob Bowie, who oversaw the project overall. We're going to not need this next slide because it's a recorded session, and so you're not going to need all your buttons in Collaborate, and that's what these are for. And we're going to move straight onto a little bit of detail on how we actually analyzed the data. We started, of course, with the screening and cleaning of the data. But what does it mean, and what did we actually do in this specific circumstance, and what did that entail? Well, first of all, we had to contract and check for entry errors. Now, we might wonder, why do we have entry errors if the survey, as we mentioned probably already elsewhere, they were online? Well, because not all surveys were actually online. To make sure that all schools had the opportunity to participate, even if they didn't have, sort of the technical abilities that others had, technical resources. We allowed them to fill in a pen and paper version. The pen and paper version then was, sort of collected and entered manually by a researcher into a spreadsheet. This is where possible manual entry error might have been committed, so we checked all of those by looking, for instance, at the range of answer given, make sure that actually, was still within the possible and acceptable range. We had quite a few missing cases, and in any large study of this sort. And how did we deal with missing cases? Well, there are two major, sort of different ways of dealing with missing cases. One is what's usually referred to as list-wise deletion of missing cases. This is a situation where, as soon as a participant has one answer missing, as in they skipped one question, we eliminate the whole of the rest of the participants' answer. We decided not to take on this approach because it's very crude and it leads to the elimination of even some data that could be good for analysis. So what we did, we set a threshold. We said, well, if a participant doesn't have at least 10% of the questionnaire filled, then we'll delete the whole attempt. Otherwise, we'll keep what is good, what we have, and will operate what's called a case-wise deletion, which is that participant will be eliminated from the analysis where they don't have given an answer for the particular question that is under scrutiny. It's quite obvious. This is why the number of participants actually varies from time to time and from analysis to analysis if you look at the full report. We then looked at the distribution of our variables. Some variables are continuous variables, so we could actually have graphs, histograms, and indexes of dispersions, such as standard deviation, standard error, and the sort. For others, the variables that actually were categorical, we have frequency tables, and also different kinds of analyses are carried out. There were some questions in the questionnaire that were open-ended, and clearly we analyze them with a different software, not with the same software, which was SPSS, that we used for our quantitative analysis. We moved those that data to NVivo, and they were analyzed differently. And then there were also additional variables. You can call them metadata that we had available, information about the schools that were then entered manually into the database. So a lot of work there. How do we then analyze our data? Well, first of all, we analyzed section by section, first of all. So each question, for instance, within each section of the questionnaire was analyzed on its own. We looked at, as we were saying, the distribution, the difference between, sort of various kind of participants for that question, and so on. What we then did was to look at the relationship between sections of the questionnaire. So, for instance, we were interested in knowing to what extent level of connection to the school or to the church seem to be related to other behavioral, for instance, measure of how certain behaviors are displayed by our participants. And that was done at that stage. But because there was overall a really large level of variability, as you can imagine, to those interested, I can say that the standard deviation, for instance, most of our variables are measured on a scale that goes from 0 to 100. And most of the standard deviations, actually quite consistently, I'd say, were around 30. That is, it's not extremely high, but it is rather high. What does it mean? Well, it means that there is, on average, a variation of about 30 points around the average score. So that's not surprising. So it's not surprising we have variability. Variability is good, is what allows us to actually run analysis, what we want to explain. It's what allows us to, sort of correlate variables and so on. But if it's too high, it actually gives us, sort of scope for further analysis. Where is that variability coming from? So that's why the relationship between section. That's also why afterward we did analysis by schools, where we compared different kinds of school according to analysis within the school. So within each school we look at each of these distribution and these relationship between sections that we've mentioned so far. It's later on then that we started looking at the school comparisons using instance some of these characteristics. These are the additional variables that I was mentioning earlier on were entered manually. So for instance, of the 20 schools that accepted our invitation to take part in the study overall and then in the quantitative survey part, some were rural and some were urban. And that's usually a very important distinction, because the way in which life is carried out in different geographical areas is different. We also actually had an additional variable, which was the geographical area, which was either, north part of the country, Midlands, or south of the country, which I haven't added here actually. But anyway, along the same line, the urban versus rural was for us much more interesting, and we coded the data for that. Some of the schools are relatively small, as you can see. School 16 has less than 100 pupils within it, while others are actually quite large, around 450 children. What also varies, of course, is the type of school. Some of our schools were Church of England and some were Catholic school, with then the additional, sort of distinction and denomination that you can find there. The age range of the children in the school varied. Traditionally is 4 to 11, but as you can see, some are only 3 to 7 and some are 5 to 11. And then the last common lecture represents the number of school meals, the percentage of children that are eligible for free school meals, which is a very crude and rough estimate of the social economical status of the children. And again, those are variables that traditionally are used in school comparisons. Can be quite useful. The next slide shows the number of participants. We're not going to talk about focus group data for today. That's done, as I was saying, somewhere else. And you can find probably access via the Nexus website all the other recordings for those presentations and that in-depth sort of analysis. But yeah, we can see actually that, just to give you a flavor of the scale of the project, 454 participants took part in focus group interviews. Interviews of at least an hour at the time, if not more, in groups of, sort of 2 to 3, 5 individuals. So really an awful amount of data. Similarly, the survey, whether it was in pen and paper or online version, was distributed and returned by a total of 1,002 participants from 17 schools, though, because 3 of the schools had to be eliminated because only too few participants actually returned the questionnaire. And so it really didn't make sense to include them in the analysis, where all they would have brought was variability without that size, that the large number, that to eliminate or to counter for some of that variability, what we call the within group variability, that they would have only brought between group variability. So anyway, we eliminated the 3 schools where the returns were very low, and we were left with 730 pupils, 166 parents, and 106 stakeholders overall. What we'll see later on is that the numbers we are looking in specific at today are of course lower than that. First of all, because we are only comparing 2 schools, School 1 and School 8, later on in the rest of the slides, and also because as far as, for instance, children, the pupils are concerned, we found that most of the errors there were in terms of, for instance, the missing cases, or also, yes, in the pen and paper version, the mistakes we could see when children wrote on the questionnaire, where they actually were asking questions, where they left half unanswered, half of the questions unanswered, were coming from lower years children. So we decided to only include year 5 and year 6 children. We've brought our sample overall across all of the schools to 566, and then we'll see in the 2 schools that we are looking at today, of course, less than that. We're comparing 2 schools, which one? Well, we decided to look at School 1, which is a large school in an urban location. It's a Catholic school in the southeast of England, with very few, less than 5% of the children on free school meals, as opposed to School 8, which was half the size, less than 250 pupils, still in an urban southeast region, but this is a Church of England, so most of the difference are in terms of type of school and size of the school. So a large Catholic school versus a smallish, we can say, not the smallest of the schools, but a relatively small Church of England school with less than 10% of the children on free school meals. What can we find? There's loads of information. All of the graphs that follow have this format, so we'll spend a little bit more time talking about these, and then we'll go much more quickly through the rest, because the trend we'll see once we pick them up are actually, quite interestingly, repeated. So how are the data analyzed and structured here? Well, you have at the top the question. Here we asked, for instance, the pupils, the ones in the blue bars, how much do you know? How much do you talk about what happens in school with regards to a series of spiritually related topics? All right, so activities in the local church, prayer, school values, messy church, reflection time, godly play, and so on. What we can see is that there is again variability between the blue lines. There are certain things that actually are talked about a lot, school values and prayers, and others that are actually talked about very little, like, your messy church or what happens in reflection time. But that is not surprising. A reflection time is private. You wouldn't go home and say, Mom, today I actually reflected about this and that. All right? If the conversation goes there, maybe what I try to say is that it's much more difficult to express or talk about your personal reflection time. Well, on the other hand, school values, not surprisingly, get talked about a lot. So those are the things that go home from school, all right, which is the, sort of what we're really interested in knowing about here. So variability, but overall, sort of a certain decent amount, you can say. But what's of course also striking is the difference between the blue bars, what the children say, actually they talk about, and what the parents say that they actually know, or what the stakeholders think that actually is happening. And by stakeholders, by the way, it was in one of the previous slides, we actually mean the teachers, we mean the governors, we mean the clergy, anybody else who's an adult and is not a parent, basically, that is involved with the school life. And what we can see is that the orange and the grey bars are much more similar, almost identical to each other, if you consider that, sort of these are different people answering, so they're strikingly similar, but much higher than the estimations given by the children. So the question here is like, who's right and who's wrong? But it's really not the right way of looking at it. It's not as if there is really a truth and we are trying to uncover it here. We are really talking about perspectives. So the perspective that the children and the other grown-ups, if we want to bunch together, parents and stakeholders. So their views actually varies, and there is, in that sense, we call it an overestimation. And the trend is actually different if we now look at school 8. Now, school 1, the data, for instance, as far as children are concerned, were coming from 92 children, which is about 72% of all of those in year 5 and 6. We don't know what the corresponding, percentage would have been for parents and stakeholders, because we don't know what the total number of parents, carers, and stakeholder in total is. So we've only referred to. And just to compare, you see that there's a higher response rate in general in school 1 than in school 5. And the size is also, as I was saying, smaller in school 8 than in school 1. But the percentage, as you see, is also lower. So smaller school, but also lower percentage of response. But what's happening actually in school 8 is that the blue bars are way higher than the corresponding blue bars in school 1. What's really talked about the most is not the same. As you can see, school 8 gives more time to assembly and collective worship, to religious education, faith, belief and spirituality than actually, school value themselves, which was in fact the highest, bar as far as the pupil are concerned in school 1. So diversity there in what the priorities are, and also though look at the relative size, height of the orange, for instance, and the blue bars. The trend is inversed, all right? Here in school 8 are the blue bars that are higher than the orange ones. So the children talk much more about all of these things that happen compared, in the smaller Church of England school than in the larger Catholic one. And they think that they do so more than their own parents or, actually say the children do. So that trend of the results is really what carries on throughout the rest of the questions. So I'm going to guide you relatively, a bit more quickly through them. The next section, the next, part of the questioner asked in a similar manner on a scale that was from 0 to 100, never or not very much, to all the times, a lot. How often when at home do you or your child, depending on who the question was directed to, do any of the following. And here's a series of activities that we actually proposed to be rated. Act out Bible stories, read religious stories, retell Bible stories. I'm going to scroll through, say prayers, say hymns, and so on. Now, if you're wondering, as before, where do we come and how did we come up with this set of spiritually related activities? Well, from the focus group. What we did after all these hours and hours of interviews and focus group, we sat together and we decided to, extract the emerging themes of these conversations, and these are the ones that emerge, and therefore we fed them back into the survey this way. So again, what can we find here? Well, the children answers. So children extent to which they engage in any of this spiritual activity is higher in school 8 than in school 1. And again, that the way in which parents and stakeholders relate to the children's answer is the opposite in the two schools. While in school 1, parents and stakeholders overrate, so give answers that are higher than the children ones. And for the majority of the case, school 8, trend is reversed. Their answers are lower. Any other interesting, for instance, difference that we can actually spot? Well, as far as children in school 8 are concerned, their more frequently carried out activity are saying prayers and singing hymns. And the ones that are the lowest are, for instance, act out Bible stories. And in school 1, we can see, for instance, that reflection of spirituality actually has a different place. Okay, so comparatively, more reflection is probably done in, would you say, yes, school 8, probably than in school 1. Excuse me. If we move on to how often, when at home, do you ask questions about, it's quite interesting to also see, where the differences are. We can see that, again, in school 1, children ask loads of questions about God, Jesus, and prayer, and much so less about the Trinity or other faiths or Bible stories. I'm going to leave death out of this conversation because we did a whole set of analysis about death. That actually shows very interesting trends that here, are actually not captured. But again, we see how the orange bars are higher than the blues in most cases, although not all, in school 1, while in school 8, in school 1, in school 8, the trend is reversed. The orange bars are always lower than, apart from, yes, other faiths, than the blue ones. Some of these differences are significant, some are not. We haven't talked about significance so far, but, the number here are not huge, really. Hence, some of the differences are not statistically different. When we talk about the whole sample in the report, then yes, most of the differences are significant. Here I haven't reported them because the pattern is really varied. So we are really just interested in looking at the trend. So again, very similar pattern though. God and Jesus and prayer are some of the things that are talked about the most, and other faiths, unfortunately, and the Trinity, understandably, possibly, relatively difficult subject to talk about, is something that children ask when they go home. Now, this is a really interesting part of the data to look at. We asked our participants to rate who is the initiator of these conversation of activities. These things that we talked about are generally started by either the child or somebody else in the family. Things to note about here is that the bars don't add to 100. We haven't asked in a mutually exclusive way, is either the child or somebody else. We asked to rate both of them out of a 0 to 100. So it could be that some people actually say, well, sometimes I feel like I ask all the questions, I initiate or start this activity all the times. And the same person some other times could have felt actually somebody else to do that. So we allowed for both, set of answers to be collected and answered separately, both on a 0 to 100. So that's why, for instance, the blue bars that don't add to 100 or the orange or the grey, they're not supposed to. That was a conscious choice. We believed it was the right thing to do so. But what sense can we make out of this data? Well, first of all, that actually, if we start looking at the child and the child's answer, and the pupil's answer about the child, so the blue bars, they're actually all quite high. There's almost never in any of the school people that say, well, actually, no, the child is a passive, really, respondent and is a passive, element of these interactions. So children are active in all these activities, interactions, and conversations. There are, of course, differences, right? So, for instance, children consistently think that others are more often initiated than themselves of these activities, and that's fine. But this difference is not huge. It's not 0 versus 100, all right? And it's about, 20 points there. Once we ask the same question, though, to parents, can you see how there is almost no difference, all right? The extent to which, the child or others initiate actually is much more similar, especially so in school 8 than in school 1. And similarly, again, as far as the stakeholder is concerned. So there is a view that seems to reflect fairness, equal distribution. So not a passive role of the child, which is really, really interesting and important. The next slide actually looks at some more behavioral measures that actually go a little more beyond the house as well. So we asked, how often when at home do you show signs of caring about other people, caring about the environment, acting out, valuing school values, helping people in the local community, or also speaking out about things that are wrong, that sense of activism in that way. And what we found, once again, is that these behaviors are all displayed with a really healthy, big percentage. And there is variability, of course, a lot of variability, even within, for instance, each of these schools, still, interestingly. So we see that things like caring about other people is done by the children and also, according to parents and stakeholder, much more than, for instance, helping people in the local community. Now, this can be surprising because, these are 10 and 11 years old children. It's relatively difficult for them to be engaged in the community. But actually, nowadays, the schools do offer a number of opportunities. So it's not just about not having the opportunities, about how often these opportunities are taken. And the explanation we gave to this difference, why aren't they the same? Why helping others, caring about others, is not the same as actually helping? Well, because we think the first category of others, the other people, caring about other people, might be referred as the others in the immediate circle of family and friends of the person. Community is a larger, more, if you want, removed set of people from the core, from the center of the child. And so it's not surprising that actually, that there is such a difference. But again, we can see that in general, children in school 8 seem to be reporting higher scores, seem to be engaged in all of these behaviors, a little bit more, or at least as far as children is concerned, than those in school 1. Something that I haven't said yet, but it's quite interesting, I spent a lot of time actually doing, some of you might, sort of think about it, is, well, if you have the option of saying never and all the times, that of course kind of skews the distribution. Yes, it does indeed. These are data that are measured on an interval scale, and we know very well that parametric analysis, as the ones that sort of I would have done here, are actually very much affected. So the mean result here is very much affected by extreme cases, the 0 of the hundreds. So what I have done, I've done a whole set of parallel analysis where I eliminated the zeros and the 100 responses. And I have then compared what's left in terms, what the mean is. And actually, all of these trends are still there. You can still find that these mean are not exactly the same. Of course, they're shifted up or down, but the trend and the patterns are still the same. So I actually kept the data in, because removing the 0 and the hundreds, the participant, the 100, it's not as if they count as outliers, just in case you were wondering, okay? So they're well integrated and they don't unduly affect what the mean results actually are. So that's, something if you were concerned about, that, we did and we took care of. Very quickly, just the last 2 slides. Here, how strong we are assessing how strong the connection to the school or the local church is. And actually, we find similar patterns in both schools. That is, the children, parents, and stakeholders feel much more connected to the school than the local church. And there are some slight variations, but they're actually not huge. Okay, so school is usually felt as a connection more strongly than the local church. And finally, how much do others know about your spiritual life? Well, we asked children, do others know about what, the fact that you have a spiritual life? We also ask who is more likely to know about that. That's reported somewhere else, which is quite interesting as well. What we can see again, very reassuringly and comforting, that actually children are quite confident that a lot of people, know. Others do know about my spiritual life, yes, about 50% of the time. So yeah, it's not incredible. It's not 100%. It's not an 80, but it's a healthy, midpoint of the scale, a little bit higher in, again, school 8 than in school 1 as far as the children's rating is concerned. The parents' one is higher in school 1 than in school 8, and it's about the same read as far as stakeholders are concerned. So what can we conclude from these results? Well, first of all, that there is a lot of variability in the data, and this is just a flavor of where some of this variability can come from. Again, this is between schools variability. Then there is the one within, and there is the one, sort of coming from specific differences between schools. And all of that is actually in the report. So you have the opportunity, sort of in more depth reading if you want there. So diversity, yes, comes from a variety of places. We can explain some of this variability. Some others, honestly, we can't. It's just there. And there's not, we can't make sense of everything there is in our data. Mostly because it wasn't our main study. It wasn't our main purpose in this study. We set out to know what can be done to help foster the children's spiritual well-being at home as well as at school and in church. And so some of this diversity, it's helpful in answering the question, but it wasn't really the main, sort of a aim of this study. Pupils, parents, and stakeholders behave very differently in different schools. And we have some insights into where that comes from. So here we looked at the difference between a Catholic and a Church of England school that also happened to be at the same time large and small. We have other situations where the situation is reversed. Some schools also, we know, engage with the survey more than others. So in itself, there was different interest in actually participating. Well, all of the schools were interested in participating, but as far as this, section is concerned, they just had more difficulties for whatever reason. Now, the data is incredibly rich, and what we've done really well is in actually cross-fertilizing, so to speak, the two sections of the study. So the qualitative and the quantitative data that really have been integrated. And we are able in the report to really interweave that narrative and to enrich our understanding and the discussion of the results from the two kind of data that we've analyzed. Schools hopefully will be able to interpret and feedback their reactions, and we're actually quite interested in any way possible to receive more feedback from the school, from saying, well, actually, of the interpretation that you propose, this is what makes more sense for us, because really it's that sort of process of, if you want, triage of 360. So any sort of further conversation you can have about these are very much welcome. Right, I think this is plenty for today. Thank you very much, and I remind you that there will be similar opportunities to go into depth for other sections of the study in some others of our recordings. Thank you very much.